Before anything, I thanks a lot to Eduardo Reynoso that invited me to give this talk, and all people involved in the ISCP that is doing a great effort to promote the scientific psychology. Thanks all the audience that uses this time for listening to some findings and reflections. I'm very enthusiastic with the possibility of sharing with you some ideas that me and some of my colleagues have developed in some years. I will begin the talk showing this image, the cities. The cities are designed to, the cities are designed supposedly to live in a place with different streets for inappropriate transportation between places. Here, there appears a photo from Guadalajara at the 30s, 1930. Well, on this topic, Jane Jacobs wrote a book named The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Here, she described, among other topics, the need for small blocks in the cities. This because the long blocks offer less opportunity to travel, and afterwards, more isolated places are reproduced. However, small blocks offer more opportunities to move from one place to another, using different paths, hence avoiding the high concentration of some routes because they're more easily distributed, and that produce less isolated places. She concludes that most blocks must be short, that is, straight, and opportunities to turn corners must be frequent. Well, these assertions conduct to the topic of the present talk, the patterns of behavior and variability, the Dashiell Reloaded. Here, I must mention that this research was developed together with Dania Cepeda, that has been part of this project since the beginning. And my student, Elias Romero, an undergraduate student, whose collaboration has been fundamental. Thanks to the International Society for Comparative Psychology for the invitation to participate on this lecture series. While reading the work of Edward Tolman, I found once the reference to one author that was illuminating. It was John Frederick Dashiell. Who is John Dashiell? Well, he founded the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in 1920. With Dr. Dashiell's leadership, this psychology department became one of the first in the US with the behavior-oriented focus. He served as chair in the Department of Psychology from 1920 to 1949. So in these years, he developed one work that in which I was particularly interested. It was in the 30s, the direction orientation in maze running by the White Rat, published in the Comparative Psychology monographs. And there, John Dashiell described a series of experiments that began in 1925. It holds about 5 years of research in that monograph. So why I was interested in annual document, perhaps fanatic for the oldies. Well, it was a real fact that there was not available in my library this work. There were no PDF, no electronic copies. So it was almost a papyrus. But with the help of my friend Aaron Blaisdell, we took the crusade to get the paper, and finally, thanks Aaron Blaisdell, we got it. we got it in a special collection in the UCLA library. So after several difficulties to get the original, an original copy of that work of John Dashiell, the first thing that I remember I did, in fact, in the house of Aaron, was to introduce inside the publication, inside the paper. Even when Dashiell used different kinds of mazes, the open field only multiple choice maze was what we were interested in. It consisted in a platform enclosed by a wall of plastic, black painted, that permitted travel from the entrance to exit by many crisscrossing and equal length alternative pathways. This structure perhaps reminds you the structure of the cities. If you need to travel from one point to another point, you have different paths you can travel, and all of them have the same distance. At least in the beginning, it could be possible that the rats, in this case, make some mistakes. One mistake is defined when the path returns to the origin, for example, turning to the left or turning to the south part. Only the movements to the right and to the top of this diagram is the correct choices. Well, in this kind of maze, up to 20 different correct routes we can find. All of them are correct. So here, what John Dashiell did was to mark with different kind of lines all the different paths that are correct in this maze. They are divided into two graphs in order to see clearly each one. And the following question was, well, what does rat do in this kind of maze where there are not cul-de-sacs? So all the alleys have an open area. Well, the first thing that he found is that the rats learn the maze not by fixating some particular pathway, but by running in the general direction of the exit, using a variety of different routes from entrance to exit. Each route being taken without error and frequently without any previous practice. So if we see the diagrams, there are a lot of different paths that the rats followed. Some of them with some mistakes. For example, this one that I signal with my mouse, but there are only a few of them that have some mistakes. Here, the main result is that in no case the runs were consistently of the same type. The consecutive trials showed different paths for most of the rats. Well, since the result was the variation of the path each time the rats run the maze, hence a measure of variability must be used. And you measure the variability as an entropy measure is the way that a lot of studies about variability measure, use as a measure. In this formulation that is used for different situations, the equation shows that the RF subindex I indicates the relative frequency of one route. The N indicates the error-free routes for reaching the goal. And if you obtain a value of U of 1, that means that that subject reached the maximum variability in the environment. Or on the contrary, if the U value is 0, so what that means that is a fixed performance, no variation in that environment. So the amount of entropy from start to the exit could be measured by this formulation. And in order to calculate that variability with the data of Dashiell, we take the table, the original table, the results of the paper, and there were extract the path categories to evaluate the variability for the 6 rats that he reported in that experiment, that particular experiment. There are a lot of them. So here, the U value with the data of Dashiell, the U value was in average very close to 0.5, with a dispersion of 0.3 to 0.8. Note that in this case, it's very important note that this is an spontaneous variability, is not reinforced. All the paths ended with food, all of them. There was no differential reinforcement. All the paths ended in one piece of food. Well, last year, we made our application of the work of Dashiell, and it's published in the International Journal of Comparative Psychology. And we replicated with 23 female albino rats. We use the open-only multiple choice maze that we described, that we name it as Dashiell maze. And as reinforcer or a reward, we use 5 pieces of food. In this occasion, we use the automated video tracker, the system of Etovision by the brand of Noldus. This was published by Idania Cepeda and me. And here I show you the experimental setting. It was an apparatus created with plastic boxes, black painted, and the video tracker registered and digitalized the images. So the analysis was registered in XY axis in the time of each position, and the picture of that is seen like in the screen is shown. Well, the results. What we obtained in the results is very similar data from the original obtained by Dashiell in the 30. The average was close to 0.5, and the dispersion of data were within the same rank. The case of humans, because we make a comparison with humans, a comparative procedure. The case of humans, the average was a little higher. Nevertheless, no significant difference was found. The main difference was the dispersion of data. Some participants, human participants, were close to the maximum variability, close to 1. In fact, one of them reached 1, and others showed a very fixed trajectory in different trials. In fact, one of them was completely fixed pathway to find out the goal. Well, John Dashiell noted that aside from the different successive routes that the rats took, not all of the paths were equally probable to occur. Some paths were more frequent than others. This was reported as an incidental result. He noted that some subjects tended to use more the round, the edge type of run. Here is represented by the blue color in the A or T root, the blue and red colors, or blue and orange, something like that. And other subjects used more the zigzag stroke type. It was marked by the green and the yellow lines. So this is one non-expected result because there are variations, but those variations of the routes are within the limits of some kind of specific routes, and these were the more frequent. There are still other subjects that show a frequency of type intermediate between these kind of routes. Well, this incidental observation wasn't further discussed, but looking for some explanations, we found that meanwhile, by those same years, but in the UCLA, our researchers generally published this paper in the Journal Comparative Psychology. He used one open field with a star box and a goal outside the platform. Those boxes were located in the extremes of the platform, and he found that this spatial layout affords a strong tendency to learn and repeat the shortest distance. We can see the representations, and where at the first group of trials, the rats show more or less wandering about in the environment, and with a few of trials, that wandering was eliminated. Nevertheless, see the deviation from the perfect diagonal. There are some points of deviation that it could be interesting for the following discussion. Well, in a second procedure, generally inserted plates as obstacles in the open field. What happened is that at the beginning, the plates produced more exploration. However, this spatial layout affords more direct route at the end of the trials. As you can see, there are more direct diagonals from the beginning to the end of the platform, with just only a few deviation from the line. So with this manipulation of the plate, the alternated plates give rise to a diagonal alleys. We can see that a range of the plates form one another alley from the start to the end. Well, in a following procedure, generally collocated the plates in a more irregular form. In this case, there was no straight alley from the beginning to the end. If the rat took a route, it was defined with the rat finds an obstacle and had to turn to one of the different possibilities to follow one straight alley, but it was again interrupted by one of the plates, and so on until they obtain until they reach the goal. So this manipulation what produced was, well, at the beginning, the plates produced exploration, since very similar to the last one procedure, but this special layout did not afford a direct path. It was produced because there was not a direct diagonal to the goal. But what does we can learn of these procedures according to the results that we find in the Dashiell maze. Well, in one paper in preparation, Cabrera and Cepeda said that after some trials, the gingerly may generate a fixed path from start to goal, while the Dashiell maze generates novel paths to the goal. Two important differences. In the gingerly maze, the obstacles are placed in ordinary positions, while the Dashiell maze uses cubes aligned in right angles. Well, if we remember the different trajectories that afford the gingerly maze, we could find that it depended of the lines, or the diagonal lines that could be formed by the plates inserted. So apparently the plates that were inserted forming one direct line, it make more perfect diagonal lines than in the situation where there are not a plate. So where it was a open field. In the case of the Dashiell maze, we try to categorize the different paths, and in order to understand what trajectory affords the Dashiell maze. So we categorize the kind of paths according to the number of possible turns to reach the goal. So here we see in this column that this kind of paths, there are only two paths that have only one turn to reach the goal. Long distances without turns and only one turn. Another kind of path includes two turns of 90 degrees each one. It could be of different kinds, but they have the characteristic have only two turns of 90 degrees. There are some of them that have 3 turns, another 4 turns, and the last one that is a 5 turn, is the most possible turns that affords this situation. So the frequency of all of them make a sum of 20 possible correct paths. Well, this figure represents the proportion in which this variable was observed. The white circles represent the early trials. The black ones represent the last trials. So we can see that at the beginning, there are a lot frequency of rats that made a route like this one on only one turn, and the other were not frequently selected, but it was only on very, very early trials. At the end of the sessions, the last trials, they used more the zigzag strategy to reach the goal. Here is very interesting result because, well, it could be, it is possible that the thinking is that more turns, it could be more difficult to do against only make a turn. So why the rats prefer when they have more experience to make more turns? Well, this is one of the reasons by which I select a number that name for the presentation, that this kind of maze affords behavioral patterns that are shown by this high frequency of some of them, but it affords variability because even when they are, some of them are more frequent than another, most of the time, the sequence of different trials do not repeat the same path. So the Dashiell maze is a combination of that two kind of strategies to show variability, spontaneous variability because it's not reinforced, but there is a tendency to show a behavioral pattern according to the disposition of that particular maze. Where I try to be short in order to have time for some comments, so I prefer here to put the conclusions. Some of them are more theoretical in order to do more, to engage in more comments. One of them is that if diagonal paths allow for straight routes to reduce excess of effort is a measure of errors, so fixed routes will be followed. If a grid of right angles means avoiding diagonal paths, as the Dashiell maze, so the variability emerges. This is in touch with the assertion of some other authors, for example, Reed, that says that variability of responding to certain objects and events are a basic feature of behavior enabled by the layout of the objects in the environment. Hence, fixed responses to situations are likely to require the evolution of spatial mechanisms for the preservation of particular adaptive modes of behavior. So it's more the rule, the variability, than the fixation. This contrasts to the traditional account in which it's assumed that animals have a set of behaviors that are essentially mechanistic and that the capacity for flexibility is added. Well, what's next? If you remember in the first slide, I present the photography of the city of Guadalajara, 30s. In fact, it was I select that photography of Guadalajara 30s, the same year that John Dashiell designed, at least published that work. That was a form of Guadalajara where we're working Dashiell. And the idea for that we are working that with the area of Idiana Cepeda Insight is measuring the variability in the humans by the virtual Dashiell maze. The advantage of this way to measure variability is that the environmental layout of the Dashiell maze provides an adequate setting for assessing behavioral variability, facilitating further comparative and translational research into humans and other species within the realm of variability and creativity. His work was too inspired by some of the work of David Stallman, in which he tried to compare different tasks in order to make more, to have a measure of variability comparable of the children, humans, and with rats in order to have a stronger procedure that was representing of the most organism. Well, in order to have time to question and comment, just I finish showing the institutions and people that is participating. Idiana Cepeda, obviously, Elias Romero, undergraduate student that is making the bachelor thesis with his project, with another kind of manipulations that, well, in another opportunity, we plan to show. Odalis Arboleda, University of Aguascalientes, Adriana Rincón, Denise Ochoa, Alexis Cuevas, y Evelyn González Cabrera, all of them students there in the University of Guadalajara, Ocotlán. Thanks for your attention.